Dr. Greer.
Well, on that note, it reminds me of a conversation I had with some people at the CIA, and there's a term that's used there, and you'll forgive my vernacular, where much of this subject is referred to as WSFM. Sounds like a radio station. It means weird science and frickin' magic. And that is the term that's used at the CIA and other places to describe some of this. And I think that what we have to understand is that if you're dealing with, and I do want to go into this because this is part of the summary and brief I provided in the Obama briefing and elsewhere. If you're dealing with civilizations that are 10 to the 6th to 10 to the 7th years, hundreds of thousands to millions of years, technologically more developed than we are, every manifestation of their technology would look like magic to us. For example, if you were to go back to the time of Thomas Jefferson and show them an iPhone, or worse, to Salem, Massachusetts, you'd be burned at the stake as a witch, because everything would be absolutely look like magic. So I think that we have to have a certain amount of humility in realizing that when we're dealing with a universe that is vast and infinite, that in our own galaxy alone, which has 100 billion star systems, the same number of stars that we have as we have neurons in our brain, interestingly, that we're dealing with civilizations just in our own galaxy, which is one of billions, that are able to go through interstellar space. Now, I want to touch on this for a moment because it deals with a little bit that Linda referred to in terms of trans-dimensional or other dimensions. And the technologies and the sciences dealing with this subject are what we have termed trans-dimensional interstellar, TDIS. And this refers to very advanced sciences and technologies where there is a nexus between electromagnetism in the magnetic field, gravitational forces in three-dimensional space and time, and what Dr. John at Princeton in the engineering lab began to prove is the science of consciousness, which was actually an issue that I did talk a fair amount with Lawrence Rockefeller about. Now, a lot of people say, well, this gets into the deep end of the pool very quickly, and in fact it does. But I think that it's important to understand that if you're dealing with civilizations that have gotten here, and that's what we're dealing with, you're not dealing with something that can go just straight through space at the speed of light even, because the speed of light is too slow. And I remember when I was having dinner with CIA Director Woolsey and his wife, and actually the really most insightful question came from Dr. Woolsey, who at the time was Chief Operating Officer of the National Academy of Sciences. And she said, what I want to know is, how are these civilizations communicating across the vastness of space? Because your cell phone and radio waves are going at the speed of light. And I said, yes, that's just too slow. Speed of light is way too slow. And I had a gut check. I said, do I tell her the truth and lose all credibility as a scientist and a doctor? Or do I tell her something that sounds scientific, but that's really not true? And ever since then, I have vowed that if someone is intelligent enough to ask the question, I will provide the answer as truthfully as I can. So I turned to her and I said, well, Dr. Woolsey, it's like this. It turns out thinking is the best way to travel. And the speed of thought is not quantifiable. However, when you start getting into the new physics that have been done, where you have the ability to teleport across vast distances instantly, and this has been done with particles, but we're talking about civilizations that can do it with entire spacecraft and occupants. You're dealing with an entirely new physics. But their communication devices and their own innate abilities allow for thought-actuated events. And I know Dr. Wood may mention this, that he discovered when he was doing some work for old man McDonald of McDonnell Douglas, that he looked into some cases where in some meetings with these ETs involved a little box, and there was a direct thought communication, but it was also being facilitated through electronics. And this is something that we call technology-assisted consciousness and thought. And this is a very specific area of study that I've really devoted about 22 years to, which may be beyond the scope of this hearing. But I think that in terms of just bringing this issue around, there are so many aspects of it that are very exciting from the point of view of science, technology, and understanding the universe and ourselves. And also, who are we? And where did we come from? And how is it that we exist in this cosmos that is and I agree with Edgar Mitchell on this, that is a conscious quantum hologram that is awake and that we are all part of. And that mind itself is the ultimate final frontier, not space, but consciousness in mind. Now, I know that Lawrence Rockefeller was very interested in these things because I had conversations with him also. But one of the things that I found when I was working with these folks is that there's a saying in American business, everyone wants to be first to be second. And so in this case, there's so many people who have had an interest in this, but they want to hold back and not speak the whole truth about it. But I think we need to be able to liberate ourselves to speak the truth. And it involves many, many complex issues, part of which has been touched on in the last 15 or 20 minutes. One thing I also want to point out is that if we're being visited by advanced civilizations, and it's our assessment that certainly we are, who is handling that relationship? Do we cede that management to the military-industrial complex, and what are the consequences of doing so? Think about this very carefully. I remember doing a meeting with the Boutros-Ghali family, the UN Secretary General, his wife Leah Ghali, and we were talking about this. And Leah Ghali turned to me and she said, "Dr. Greer, we need you to do this now. We need you to do." I said, "I'm a country doctor in North Carolina rattling around in an emergency department. You're the head of the world." She says, "No, we can't. It's too dangerous for Boutros." I'm quoting. And then I remember talking to this wonderful senator, Claiborne Pell, who was mentioned earlier, and I was speaking with him, and I would never have gone to college if not for a Pell Grant, because I was very, very, very poor. Grew up in North Carolina, had no resources, put myself through the last years of high school and college and med school, but, I mean, really poor. And most people don't know that, but what I found when I was talking to Senator Pell, who was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and I was at a meeting with Edgar Mitchell and some other folks, and I looked at him, and he said, "Dr. Greer, I have never been given any information on this, even though I have inquired through any official channels." And I said, "Yes, sir, what a shame, because you, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, have been denied the responsibility of dealing with the ultimate foreign relations issue." And I pointed to the stars above our heads. And he looked at me through those horn-rimmed glasses and said, "Well, you know, Dr. Greer, you may be right." I said, "Well, I am." And I said, "Well, what a shame." So I think this is another dimension. There's the science and technology part of it, but there's the part of it about relationships. And we are not alone in the universe. And we need to have a situation on this planet where our higher nature, our better angels, folks like Senator Pell and others who would approach this in an enlightened way, could reach out and form what has begun to be discussed in the French government that I referred to earlier in this Ministry of Defense memo to me, a peaceful interplanetary, interstellar diplomatic initiative. And to be honest with you, that's how I first got involved with this, was to establish such an effort, which we are doing as a citizens' diplomatic effort. But in the meanwhile, I got diverted into this morass of the national security state because I felt that our leaders need to know, and more importantly, the public need to know. And we need to then figure out how we're going to advance. And in the summary I did for the President, there are a number of action points. And one of them is to appoint internationally a high-level committee of folks who could go out and make a peaceful contact that is not militarized, that is not covert, that is not being run by the national security state, but is being done on behalf of all of us, the children of Earth.
Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your testimony very much. We have a free press, so-called free press.
Theoretically, yes.
There are advantages and disadvantages of a free press. they reported the Boston bombing. There will very likely be copycat things because that was reported. Where the press is controlled, that would not be reported, so there would be no copycat. So there are some disadvantages to a free press. Where is the press in all of this? If, in fact, there is a story to be told here, why isn't the press telling that story?
Well, I can...
They seem to be, if there's a cover-up, do they not seem to be complicit in that cover-up?
Yes. Well, can I comment on that?
By control from above.
I think this is a really central issue. And I actually, over my 22 years of being deeply involved with this at various levels, I have concluded that the secrecy is very much involving the fact that on certain issues we do not have a free press any more than we have a free market economy. And I think that this is a serious problem. And I have a document that will be in the materials that I'm providing for the committee that is a 1991 CIA document where it talks about the fact that they have folks at all the major media outlets, wire services, news magazines, television networks, to change, alter, or delay and stop stories that they would like to see stopped. Now, this was released briefly and then reclassified. It was under the first President Bush term. And this is not a contested CIA document. What that means is that on certain issues, this will be absolutely, there will be an intervention. And we saw this happen with the 2001 event at this National Press Club disclosure launch 12 years ago almost today, on May 9th of 2001. And one of the people I dealt with, Bob Schwartz, who was on the board of Time Life that later became AOL, Time Warner, and CNN, the whole conglomerate, he told me that he was very good friends with Mike Wallace, and he had given him a lot of these documents that we had, and Mike Wallace wanted to do this story at 60 Minutes. And corporate CBS, and I think at the time was controlled by Westinghouse, a big defense contractor, did not permit him to do the story. Ira Rosen, who was at ABC News executive producer for 2020 and Primetime Live, he came to my home in Virginia, out near Thomas Jefferson's home, ironically, and I gave him 35 digital hours of top secret witness testimony and many documents. And he said, this, if true, is the biggest story ever. I want to do this story. I said, well, I'll cooperate fully. He had gotten his Emmy working with Mike Wallace at 60 Minutes, where he has returned. And I said, I don't think you'll be allowed to do this story. And Ira Rosen said, oh, yes, I'm the executive producer of these shows. I can do it. And I said, okay. Well, 2 weeks later, he called me up. And he said, Dr. Greer, they won't let me do this story. I said, Ira, who are they? And he said, Dr. Greer, you know who they are. Now, I could tell you probably 100 stories like that. And this becomes very worrisome. Here we are in the National Press Club. And we have a lot of enormously important information. And you know, in the New York Times, if you have 3 confirmed sources for a controversial story, they can run with it. Here, the Disclosure Project, which I founded some years ago, it was first Project Starlight when I began to work with Lawrence Rockefeller. We now have over 500. Many of them, I have the names of them, and they can be subpoenaed. Some of them, about 100 of them, we have on digital videotape. Why isn't this a story? And I think that this becomes a very important question in a democracy. You know, if you have the larger media not covering something that 50–60% of the public believe is true, and there's an enormous amount of data, 4,000 landing cases, the Cometa report where they documented the landing in Provence of a craft, the Bentwaters case where a craft landed at RAF Bentwaters and left physical trace that has been confirmed by the Ministry of Defense. We have all this hard data and information. We have radar traces of these objects moving. We have pilot cases. We have over 3,500 pilot reports in our archives. This isn't a story? How can that be? Now there's another reason, the ha-ha factor. I have met with so many senior people in government who say, I am so interested in this, but don't let anyone know that I'm interested. And the reason for it, I think, you know, you could be gay and have 5 wives and do whatever. I mean, you could do anything and be out of the closet on it, and it would be no problem. But this subject, whoa, watch out, because your career is on the line, as mine was. Okay? Now, I think that what you find is that the social opprobrium, it's an appropriate term, attached to this issue was launched in 1953. We have a CIA document that describes their attempts to debunk and ridicule the subject, but also, very important, to engage Disney Studios to make cartoons and movies about it that would marginalize the subject. This is a CIA document, little green men, ha, 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 ha. So that has worked, and there's an Air Force major, George Filer, who I know, he may be here, who said, look, the secrecy really has been created mainly through the force of just ridicule. People don't want to be made a laughing stock. And I think that fear of ridicule by one's peerage, whether you're a senator or a doctor or a university professor, is a very hard thing to overcome once the counterintelligence people have done their business, and they have on this. And it is propaganda. There is very serious information and intelligence, and I think that we have to figure out how do we get around the truth embargo, as Steve calls it. In reality, we're sort of in, it's not just the government doing the embargo, it's we are doing the embargo because we have been brainwashed to laugh at this issue instead of look at it in a very serious, scientific, in-depth, and honest and truthful way.
Can you come to any other conclusion as a body that our nation is essentially ruled by a military junta? Can you come to any other conclusion based upon all the statements that have been made?
Well, I think it's not just military. I think it's a large macroeconomic and financial system. So it's the military, industrial, corporate, financial complex. And I'm not against corporations. However, as Jefferson said, the unchecked power of a corporation. And see, if our budget is $3.8 trillion, but we're talking about something that, if it's disclosed, would threaten the privately owned interests in the oil, gas, coal, utility industries that are estimated in the multi-hundred trillions of dollars, what tail is wagging the dog of our democracy? And that's the big question.
It is sort of I shouldn't use the expression rats chasing rats, but maybe that's not such a bad
Well, it's a little bit, but you know,
example.
here's the nice thing about the new media. We have a world now where we can stream. The Huffington
Yeah,
Post,
that's what I was gonna
okay, the
get
Huffington
into.
Post
Right.
did an article about the film Sirius that's just been released that's based on our work. It had like 4 million people look at it. I think that we can do a lot that we couldn't have done 12 years ago, 5 years ago with the new media and the people's media. That's one thing. The other is that I want to put out a call for other witnesses from inside the military, intelligence, and corporate world to come forward, but who will come forward rank, serial number, name, actionable intelligence. One thing I want to comment on, there is a confusion that's been in the room a little bit today between access and control. Now, I just want to say that I have been able to provide actionable intelligence to where there would be access, but you don't necessarily have control. And I think we have to understand the difference for the president and for even some of these senior military officials that I've met with and continue to meet with. There is a huge problem there. And this is something that does need to be fixed. The media is one part, the public is one part. I think we have to get all these components going. But something that needs to be looked at from a constitutional and national security point of view is that you cannot have information like this being withheld from the commander-in-chief and senior people like the Defense Intelligence Agency head or the CIA director, which we know is going on. And I think that if we cannot